Aesop's Fables from Omnibus 4. Sometimes when you have dealt with certain things forever, you don't know they're even there. Explaining water to a fish would be difficult, and it might be hard for you to understand just how strange the word Wednesday is. Wednesday? We see through certain things so often that it is sometimes very difficult to look at them. Some of the stories found in the Fables of Aesop are very much in this category. Even if you have never read through Aesop's Fables, you are no doubt acquainted with many of them. Who has not heard of the boy who cried wolf? And everyone knows who won the famous race between the hare and the tortoise. These fables have made their way into many children's books and animated films, and they have had whole stories develop around them. They've been passed down and around in many forms for literally ages and ages. These simple, short tales have inspired artists and authors alike. An original 1912 edition, translated by V.S. Vernon Jones, with an introduction by G.K. Chesterton and illustrated by Arthur Rackham, sells now for hundreds of dollars. But you can find a facsimile, fax, or copy edition for much less and still enjoy Rackham's fabulous illustrations. And in addition to the text used for this course, you can read the fables in many different and easily available versions. So perhaps we should begin by discussing the genre of fable. What is a fable? Technically speaking, the Harper Handbook to Literature defines a fable as a short allegorical story in verse or prose, frequently of animals, told to illustrate a moral. The word fable comes from the Latin fabula and simply means little story. A fable's purpose is didactic, which means to teach, though many are quite entertaining as well. But the purpose of the fable is to teach a little lesson, to give a little advice, to comment on the ways of the world, or to satirize man and his foibles. That's why Aesop's Fables have become such popular material for children's books. It contains just the sort of life lessons that children need. General information, author, and context. Though the fables themselves predate the man known for them, Aesop became credited for passing them on, though he never wrote them down. G.K. Chesterton says, quote, "His fame is all the more deserved because he never deserved it. The firm foundations of common sense, the shrewd shots at uncommon sense that characterize all the fables belong not to him, but to humanity." In other words, these morals resonate with everyone at all times in history. Nothing too certain is known about Aesop himself, but the legendary tradition surrounding him is that he was a slave and a storyteller who lived in ancient Greece 6 centuries before Christ, from 620 to 560 BC. According to Herodotus, he was thrown off a cliff in Delphi by the citizens there, though the reason for this is unknown. Some have speculated that he was troubling the populace with his wisdom. Plato mentions that Socrates spent some of his time in prison putting Aesop's fables into verse. The first known written collection of his fables appeared around 300 BC, and a few centuries later, a Thracian slave named Phaedrus, 15 BC to 50 AD, translated them from Greek prose into Latin prose. In 1484, William Caxton printed the first English edition, and in 1692, the first English version, specifically written for children, appeared. Over the ages, collections have been translated and retranslated into many languages, with some additional fables from other sources. Now, there are many volumes of Aesop's Fables available worldwide, where they continue to endure as a well-loved form of folk literature. Significance. G.K. Chesterton observes that in a fable, quote, the wolf will always be wolfish, the fox will always be foxy. By using animals in this austere and arbitrary style, men have really succeeded in handing down those tremendous truths that are called truisms. Truisms. Whenever men are in the story, they are capable of a change of heart. But when you use animals, you can expect the nature of the animal to be fixed. That's important. Thus, we have the industrious ants showing no mercy to the hungry, idle grasshopper, or the sneaky fox stealing the proud crow's cheese by flattery. To quote Chesterton again, all these are deep truths, deeply graven on the rocks wherever men have passed. It matters nothing how old they are or how new, they are the alphabet of humanity. The fables illustrate simple truths about life, taught in memorable ways through exchanges with talking beasts and the occasional man or woman. Whether an individual man or woman repents or not, the way things are stays the same. Main characters. The main characters in the fables are animals. Objects like pots or even a pail of milk and a honey jar, the gods, Venus, Mercury, Jupiter, Hercules, and nature itself, as in the wind and the sun, or the farmer and the sea. Many of the fables have unnamed human characters, like a boy, a blacksmith, a shepherd, a farmer, a fisherman, a maid, a goatherd, a widow, or a woodcutter. Summary and setting. Each fable is driving to a point, and the point is a maxim or pithy saying. Consider this small sampling. The value of an object is in the eye of the beholder. Uninvited guests are most welcome when they leave. Only fools try to take the credit due to others. The more you want, the more you stand to lose. Grasp at the shadow, and you will lose the substance. So the plot in each fable is merely a vehicle to carry the point home. Some of the fables are shorter as 3 or 4 sentences. Some, like the country mouse and the town mouse, can run a page and a half. Characterization depends largely on what we might expect from the animal in the story. No one has to tell us to expect the lion to think highly of his own status, the wolf to be cunning, or the donkey to play the fool. The fables are timeless because they portray episodes in life that we can readily imagine at any time or any place in history. So they continue to have wide appeal. Common sense never goes out of style. Worldview. Though people of any religion and background can identify with the stories in the fables, it would be superficial to identify them as representing any particular religion. Though some may sound similar to biblical proverbs, who could disagree with honesty is the best policy? They deal mostly with hard luck and hard consequences, very much like the world of the blues. This is a very strict reap what you sow world. We do not see the biblical virtues of mercy and forgiveness in the fables, but rather common sense that comes from living in a dog-eat-dog world. The wolf dressed like a sheep is caught and killed. The hungry grasshopper begging for food is left to starve. So the moral always presents us with an incomplete picture, though true as far as it goes. The Bible does teach that a man reaps what he sows, but that is not all it teaches. Aesop is strong on law, while in Scripture we find both law and grace, gospel. In one sense, these fables demonstrate life in the raw. The strongest wins. the weakest loses. It pays to be shrewd sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. For the Christian student, reading the fables can and should be delightful. Not only are they enjoyable in themselves, but it is always enlightening to read literature that has survived millennia and been honored throughout that time for good reason. Such endurance certainly lends a respectability that should continue to be honored. The common sense found in the fables that comes from practical experience in the world, though admirable, is not the same thing as the complete wisdom that comes from above. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3:18-19, "Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God." And James says, "But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy." James 3:17. The fables do not attain to this level of wisdom, although they certainly teach the value of common sense. God bestows his common grace on the world, and mankind loves to teach one another these precepts as far as they go. These fables were most likely stories passed down from fathers to their children, teaching them the ways of the world, so the Christian reader can appreciate the fables and the limited picture they portray. The fables are more about law than grace, which is always easier for fallen men to relate to. We gravitate to lawmaking and we look to the rule, moral, or lesson being taught. Man was born to learn and born to teach. Man has a harder time understanding pure grace because it goes against our nature. It's much easier to understand the law. Work hard. Do not listen to liars. Always be wary of flatterers. Much common sense is like this and falls in the category of good advice. Man will always devise moralistic, cautionary tales to instruct others on how to get on in this life. The Christian is no exception when it comes to devising rules and looking for the law. Yet the Christian must look for grace beyond this and view life as a means of bringing God glory, not as an opportunity to get by with the least trouble and the most success. Though our text includes over 200 fables, we will consider just a sampling of them, looking at a number of the more well-known fables. We'll begin with the fox and the grapes, where we get the expression sour grapes. The hungry fox spies some delicious-looking grapes, but try as he might, he cannot reach them for all his jumping. So rather than being disappointed with his loss, he decides that the grapes are probably too sour to eat anyway. This is the behavior of the poor loser, and it is self-deception as well. He knows full well that the grapes were delicious, but he would rather tell himself a lie than admit his own defeat. So we have a prideful and lying fox, which is consistent with what we expect from the crafty nature of the fox. The tale does not condemn the fox, neither does it commend him. Rather, it is simply illustrating for us the typical fleshly response to defeat. The ants and the grasshopper has as its moral, idleness brings want. It readily reminds us of Proverbs 6:6-11. "Go to the ant, you sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which, having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. How long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall your poverty come on you like a prowler, and your need like an armed man." In this fable, the lazy, half-dead grasshopper appeals to the industrious little ants for a handout, but he meets with no pity. Again, this illustrates all law and no grace. They told him that since he had spent his summertime singing, perhaps he could dance all winter. Not only do they shut him out, they laugh as they do so. No mercy here. In contrast, consider Proverbs 14:20-21. "The poor man is hated even by his own neighbor, but the rich has many friends. He who despises his neighbor's sins, but he who has mercy on the poor, happy is he. God blesses the merciful because he is the Father of all mercies himself. In this fable, the law slams down on the grasshopper and the ants are exonerated. In Scripture, the same principle is operative. Laziness does lead to poverty, but another principle is operative as well. Mercy triumphs over judgment. One of the fables that Disney has used for a cartoon is The Country Mouse and the Town Mouse, though Disney named it The Country Cousin. This is one of the longest fables in the collection, and it also evokes a teaching found in Proverbs. Better is a dry morsel with quietness than a house full of feasting with strife. The Country Mouse concludes the fable with, "But I'd rather have a crust in peace than safety than all your fine things in the midst of such alarm and terror." This is basic to understanding contentment and also illustrates the dangers and temptations associated with living in wealth and luxury. The town mouse is captured by his worldly friend's fine talk, and he was quite pleased with the new arrangements, thinking contemptuously of his previous situation until the revelers and the dogs burst in. It was then that the country mouse came back to his senses, seeing that his lowly life had some things money could not buy. The self-respecting country mouse had gleaned from the fields, barley, nuts, etc., and the conceited city mouse was eating leftovers off the tables of the rich. The Hare and the Tortoise must be the most popular fable for children's books, and Disney made a memorable cartoon of this story as well. Slow and steady wins the race is a maxim with plenty of applications. This is reminiscent of Poor Richard's Almanac, or Proverbs again. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. 1618. The hare is so full of himself, boastful and ridiculing the tortoise. But the tortoise is game for the contest and exhibits the good quality of follow through. He does not flake out like the hare. Another biblical quotation illustrating the same principle comes to mind. Let not the one who puts on his armor boast like the one who takes it off. 1 Kings 20:11. The Shepherd Boy and the Wolf is a cautionary tale that many parents have told their children to illustrate the dangers of lying. Even when liars tell the truth, they're never believed. It's true as far as it goes. As we know, Satan is the father of all lies, John 4:44. But we also know that lies can be forgiven, that God can apply his grace to the liar's heart and wash away the sinfulness of it all. In this fable, the sheep were left to the mercy of the wolf, which is to say they received no mercy at all. They were ravaged by the wolf because of the careless shepherd boy's foolishness. Sin always has consequences, and sometimes they fall on the innocent bystanders. A liar always leaves destruction in his wake. The townspeople had lost patience with the shepherd boy, and again we see law, not grace, and we don't even know if the shepherd boy learned his lesson. This story is good incentive for truth-telling because of the consequences that befall the liar. But the Christian loves the truth because Jesus proclaimed himself to be the way, the truth, and the life. It is not just about consequences. The Wind and the Sun is an unusual fable whose characters are neither animals nor humans, but elements of nature. In this fable, the wind and the sun have a contest to see who can get a traveler to take off his coat. Never mind that the wind was at a serious disadvantage to start with because windy weather seldom causes one to take off a coat, but nevertheless, he blew up quite a gale, so the traveler kept his coat on tightly. Then the sun shone. The traveler got warm, and off came the coat. The moral of The story is sunshine of a kind and gentle manner will sooner open a poor man's heart than all the threats and force of blustering authority. Of course, sometimes that may in fact be true, but it is not a universal truth. Sometimes a poor man's heart won't open without God's intervention. Consider the Apostle Paul, for instance. He had to be knocked off his horse and blinded. In The Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, we see what happens to those who seek to deceive others. They are found out and quickly dealt with. At least in this fable, that's what happens. Be sure your sin will find you out. Numbers 32:23 is the principle that comes to mind. The wolf dressed up like a sheep, hoping to eat a sheep for his supper, but the shepherd mistook him and killed him for supper instead. Proverbs 26:27 says that whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone will have it roll back on him. It is hard not to think of the shepherd here as quite similar to the wolf. Both of them just want their supper. The Fox and the Crow has a very clever moral. Whoever listens to the music of flatterers must expect to pay the piper. In this fable, we have the crow stealing some cheese and the fox stealing the stolen cheese from the crow by means of flattery. Though the fox is the winner, he is in no way the good guy in this exchange. The fox covets the cheese that is not his, lies to the crow, and then insults the crow after winning the cheese. But the crow's foolishness is remarked on in the fable, not the fox's dishonesty or thievery. It's easy to imagine a follow-up fable where the fox gets his just reward from the crow. We will read these and a number of other fables. Having considered all this, it is important to note that Christians can often mistake Jesus' parables for fables. A parable, as Jesus told them, though similar in some ways to a fable, has additional subtleties and a very different point. The Harper Handbook to Literature defines a parable in a way that is too similar to their definition of a fable, a short tale encapsulating a moral or religious lesson. The New Geneva Study Bible, note on Matthew 13:3, has this to say about Jesus' parables. Most of Jesus' parables are clear, but they also contain a depth of meaning that only one with the right relationship to Jesus can comprehend. It is only to the disciples that Jesus gives the interpretation of the parable of the sower and the parable of the tares. The ungodly miss the deeper meaning because their lack of a proper relationship with God has darkened their thoughts and hearts. In addition to this, Christ's parables were more context dependent. Aesop's fables bring their own context with them. They are universally accessible. Christ's parables often function well at the same level, treated as a fable. But if we stop there, we will miss a great deal. Jesus' parables were not just giving little morals like a fable, but were actually prophetic pronouncements against Israel. Consider, for example, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard in Matthew 20:1-16. In this parable, some workers come early in the morning and others arrive shortly before the end of the day, but they are all paid the same amount for their labor. If we are just looking for a simple moral, we might say, be content with your pay, or don't compare yourself to others, or an employer can overpay his workers if he wants. These are all good lessons, and so the story would work as a didactic teaching lesson. But Jesus was speaking about Israel and the Gentiles. The Jews had been working in the vineyard for many centuries, serving God, obeying his law, and worshiping him as he commanded. Then along came Jesus preaching the good news, with the intent to include even the Gentiles and other sinners within Israel. And the Jews were grumbling. How could God give the kingdom to the latecomers, those who had not been working all day? This is a good example of how we can mistake the message of God's abundant grace and just get some good moral instruction from the parable instead. A modern fabulist would be someone like Dr. Seuss. If you've read stories such as The Sneetches or Horton Hears a Who, you know he's using funny animals to teach moral lessons to children about how to treat one another, about the foolishness of competition and peer pressure, and the importance of standing up for the little guy. These are fables, not parables, but because he lived thousands of years after the incarnation, Dr. Seuss understands something of grace. He sees the goodness of the self-sacrificing Horton who is persecuted by his community. Perhaps the difference between Seuss and Aesop is that Aesop's fables originated in the darkness of ancient Greece before the advent of the gospel, while Dr. Seuss was writing in the light of the Christian era. By bringing scripture to bear on these fables, I'm not trying to undermine their purpose of teaching or their ability to delight us. We ought to take them as they are intended and enjoy them, but this enjoyment should only be as far as they go. So if you have the opportunity, look at some children's editions of the stories and check out a couple of the cartoon versions.